There exists a peculiar breed of human being in our hyper-connected age, one who scrolls through feeds but never speaks, who watches stories unfold but contributes nothing to the digital narrative. They are the silent observers, the invisible witnesses to our collective performance, and their psychology reveals something profound about the human condition that most of us have forgotten in our desperate race for validation. These individuals haunt the edges of our social media platforms like shadows, present but formless, watching but unseen, and in their silence lies a wisdom that predates the internet itself, a wisdom that the great Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi understood centuries before the first status update was ever posted. The 13th century philosopher spoke of two kinds of silence, the silence of the tongue and the silence of the heart. The first, he said, lightens the burden of existence. The second reveals the innermost consciousness and allows the divine to manifest itself. Those who never post on social media have discovered both forms of silence, whether they realize it or not. They have found that their sense of self-worth doesn't depend on what other people think of them. That validation comes from within rather than from the hollow approval of strangers who scroll past their curated lives in seconds. In psychological terms, these silent observers score higher on traits like self-restraint, introspection, and emotional independence. They are less influenced by social comparison and external validation because they aren't trying to prove who they are, they're trying to understand it. This understanding requires a particular kind of courage that our society has lost. We live in a world obsessed with sharing, where silence is interpreted as absence, where invisibility is mistaken for non-existence. But Ibn Arabi taught that the observer and the observed are not separate entities, that in witnessing, we become part of what we witness, and in true observation, there is only the act of seeing itself, without the need to announce that we have seen. The person who doesn't post has intuited this mystical truth without necessarily having language for it. They understand that constant broadcasting interrupts the natural rhythm of experience, that the moment you stop to photograph your life, you step outside of living it. Their silence is not passive, it is creative, allowing life itself to unfold without interruption, permitting thoughts to deepen and experiences to grow richer in the absence of performance. The psychology behind this behavior is complex and multi-layered, woven from threads of personality, past experience, and philosophical orientation toward existence itself. Research indicates that people who browse but never post often exhibit deep thinking patterns rather than performative tendencies. They are self-contained rather than approval-seeking, curious but cautious, emotionally intelligent, but easily overstimulated by the relentless demands of digital socialization. These individuals have developed what might be called a protective silence, a buffer against the psychological hazards of social media that include anxiety, fatigue, and the erosion of authentic selfhood. They instinctively know that constant exposure and engagement drain them, that the performance of self required by social platforms is exhausting in ways that go beyond mere tiredness into something closer to existential depletion. Ibn Arabi would recognize this fatigue as a symptom of separation from the real. In his mystical philosophy, the ultimate reality, what he called the real being, has eternal self-awareness and manifests as both singular and manifold, one essence known by many names. To perceive this unity, one must renounce the individual self, dissolve the ego, and see truth through the eye of truth itself. The constant performance required by social media does precisely the opposite. It strengthens the ego, builds walls around the self, and creates an endless hall of mirrors where we see only our own reflection, repeated infinitely, growing more distorted with each iteration. The person who refuses to post has somehow sensed that this game is rigged, that participating means losing something essential, something that cannot be recovered once it's been sacrificed to the algorithm. What they lose specifically is the capacity for genuine observation. Ibn Arabi taught that positioning something other than what is looked upon, establishing a relation between observer and observed, nullifies unity, even though in reality, only the divine sees itself alone through itself. This is a difficult concept for our dualistic Western minds to grasp, but those who don't post have experienced it viscerally, if not intellectually. When you are not constantly projecting yourself outward, you begin to actually listen, to actually see. Others cease to be competitors in an endless digital performance and become fellow travelers in the mystery of life. You notice what others miss because you are not busy broadcasting, not occupied with crafting the perfect caption or filtering your experience into something palatable for public consumption. Your silence, rather than being a void, becomes filled with perception, a quality of awareness that is impossible to maintain while simultaneously performing the self. This heightened awareness brings with it certain psychological characteristics that set the non-posters apart from their more vocal peers. They tend to be more observant, more compassionate, more grounded in physical reality rather than its digital simulacrum. They are not distracted by the illusion of perfection that dominates social media, that carefully curated fantasy, where everyone is living their best life and no one ever experiences genuine suffering. The silent observer sees through this performance because they are not invested in maintaining it. Their self-esteem isn't tied to likes, comments, or digital validation, which means they can afford to be honest with themselves about what they see. They might scroll because they enjoy information or connection, but they stay quiet because they value boundaries, because they don't feel the urge to prove anything to anyone. This lack of need to prove oneself is psychologically significant. The intrinsic motivations that drive lurking behavior include social comparison and privacy concerns, while extrinsic motivations include information overload, functional overload, and social overload. All of these factors contribute to social media fatigue and anxiety, which in turn lead to the adoption of lurking as a coping strategy. But what appears on the surface to be avoidance is actually a sophisticated form of self-preservation. The person who doesn't post has recognized that social media creates a psychological loop of comparison, desire, and dissatisfaction. They have understood that every post is a form of self-commodification, turning lived experience into content, transforming the spontaneous flow of being into something calculated and strategic. Their silence becomes a conscious act of resistance against this commodification, a refusal to participate in the market where human authenticity is the currency and attention is the prize. Ibn Arabi understood that the path to truth requires the renunciation of the individual self, what Sufis call fana, the annihilation of ego. When someone's tongue and heart are both silent, he taught, the inmost consciousness becomes manifest, and the divine reveals itself. This mystical silence is not merely the absence of speech, but represents a state where the ego ceases its incessant chatter, allowing divine presence to emerge. In modern psychological terms, we might say that the constant narration of self, the internal monologue that describes and judges every experience, falls away, revealing a more fundamental mode of being that exists prior to language and thought. The person who doesn't post has stumbled upon this silence accidentally, discovering that when they stop announcing their experiences to the world, they begin to actually have them more fully, more completely, without the mediating layer of self-consciousness that performance requires. This discovery often brings a sense of alienation alongside liberation. The lurker may feel lonely or disconnected despite being plugged in, present in digital spaces but invisible, unacknowledged, as if they exist in a parallel dimension where they can see everyone, but no one can see them. They scroll through an endless stream of other people's curated lives and sometimes think, what's the point of commenting? No one cares. This thought contains both truth and distortion. It's true that individual comments rarely matter in the vast ocean of content, but the belief that no one cares reveals a deeper wound, a fear that their authentic self is somehow not worth revealing. They might be afraid of having their words mocked by others in the community, worried about privacy breaches, or concerned that their content won't be good enough to justify the risk of exposure. So they observe quietly instead, maintaining what they perceive as emotional self-preservation, but what sometimes feels like a kind of slow suffocation. Yet Ibn Arabi would say that this suffering itself is instructive, that the pain of separation is what drives the seeker toward union. The discomfort the lurker feels is not a sign that they should post more, but rather an invitation to go deeper into silence, to move beyond the silence of the tongue into the silence of the heart. When the heart becomes silent, When not only speech but also thought about the created world ceases, then the real being can manifest. This is not a comfortable process because it requires the death of the ego, the dissolution of the carefully constructed self that we believe we are. Social media makes this death nearly impossible because it constantly reinforces the ego, asking us again and again to perform our identity, to demonstrate our worth, to prove that we exist by generating content that others will consume. The person who refuses to play this game has taken the first step on a mystical path they may not even know they're walking. The psychological research confirms what Ibn Arabi intuited 8 centuries ago, that silence cultivates deeper forms of intelligence, particularly emotional intelligence. People who don't post often develop heightened sensitivity to inner states, learning to reflect before reacting, finding joy in privacy and meaning in simplicity. They realize that what truly matters doesn't always need to be displayed. It needs to be lived. This realization represents a fundamental shift in consciousness, a movement away from the externalized, performance-based self towards something more internal, more stable, more real. These individuals are not antisocial. They are selectively social, choosing depth over breadth, quality over quantity, authentic connection over the pale simulacrum that passes for friendship on most social platforms. But there is a shadow side to this psychology that must be acknowledged. Not all silence is sacred, and not all withdrawal is wise. Some people who don't post are struggling with genuine social anxiety, depression, or feelings of inadequacy that prevent them from engaging even when they want to. Their lurking behavior may be less a conscious choice than a symptom of deeper psychological distress, a manifestation of the belief that they have nothing valuable to contribute, or that their authentic self is somehow deficient. For these individuals, the silence is not liberating but imprisoning, not a path to deeper truth but a barrier that keeps them trapped in loneliness and disconnection. The challenge is to distinguish between the silence that heals and the silence that harms, between withdrawal as spiritual discipline and withdrawal as avoidance of necessary human contact. Ibn Arabi taught that true spiritual development requires balance between the rational path of philosophers and the mystical intuition of the Sufis, between the unveiling that allows for imaginal vision and the groundedness that keeps us connected to embodied reality. The person who never posts must ask themselves honest questions. Is my silence a form of spiritual practice, or is it fear masquerading as wisdom? Am I observing from a place of compassionate presence, or am I hiding because I believe I'm not good enough to be seen? Am I choosing solitude, or is solitude choosing me because I lack the courage to show up authentically in digital spaces where vulnerability is commodified and judgment is instantaneous? These are not comfortable questions, and their answers will differ for each individual. But avoiding them leads only to self-deception, the worst kind of ignorance according to the mystical tradition Ibn Arabi represents. The contemporary psychological research on lurking behavior reveals patterns that the mystics would find familiar. Studies show that both intrinsic motivations like social comparison and privacy concerns, and extrinsic motivations including information overload and social overload, are positively associated with lurking through the mediating effects of social media fatigue and anxiety. In other words, the more overwhelmed we feel by the constant demands of digital performance, the more likely we are to withdraw into silent observation. This fatigue is not merely physical tiredness, but a deeper form of existential exhaustion, a weariness of soul that comes from maintaining multiple versions of ourselves across different platforms, from constantly editing and curating and managing the impression we make on others. The lurker has simply given up this exhausting project, either consciously or unconsciously, recognizing that the game cannot be won, that no amount of likes or followers will ever fill the void that performative identity creates. Ibn Arabi would say that this void is actually the doorway to truth, that the emptiness we feel when we stop performing the self is not something to be feared but embraced. The manifestation of the divine occurs only in a form conforming to the essential predisposition of the recipient, meaning that we see only our own form in the mirror of reality, never reality itself. Social media is a distorting mirror that shows us not our true form but a grotesque caricature, a version of ourselves designed to attract attention and generate engagement rather than to reflect truth. The person who steps away from this mirror may feel initially like they're disappearing, like they're losing their identity, because so much of their sense of self has become dependent on external validation. But this loss of false identity is necessary for the emergence of something more authentic, more aligned with what Ibn Arabi called the real being that underlies all temporary forms. The mystical philosophy of Ibn Arabi provides a framework for understanding why the psychology of non-posters often involves a kind of spiritual seeking, even when the individuals involved wouldn't describe themselves as spiritual. They are seeking authenticity in a world of performance, depth in an age of surfaces, silence in an environment of constant noise. Ibn Arabi taught that the holy essence has two complementary dimensions, the hidden and the manifest. The hidden dimension is eternally concealed, leaving humanity in awe of its majesty, while the manifest dimension becomes accessible through self-revelation. Social media represents an extreme of manifestation, a culture where everything must be revealed, displayed, made visible to the public gaze. The person who doesn't post intuitively honors the hidden dimension, understanding that some aspects of existence are sacred precisely because they remain private, that constant revelation is actually a form of desecration. This understanding leads to a different relationship with time and experience. Ibn Arabi emphasized that true understanding of the divine requires observation and experience, not merely intellectual knowledge. Observation leads to a knowledge that reconciles distinction and combination, allowing the seeker to see the divine essence in all things without conflating the divine with creation. The person who doesn't post has more time and attention available for this kind of observation because they are not constantly interrupting their experience to document it. Their sense of time becomes slower, more organic, reconnecting them with the natural rhythm of existence that constant connectivity has erased. They begin to notice details that others miss, the quality of light at a particular moment, the expression on a stranger's face, the feeling of rain against skin, not because they are more perceptive by nature, but because their perception is not divided between experiencing something and simultaneously thinking about how to present that experience to an audience. This undivided attention cultivates what Sufis call presence, the quality of being fully here, fully now, without the internal chatter that separates us from direct experience. Ibn Arabi taught that mystical silence is both a practice and a goal, a means to transcend the limitations of words and intellectual reasoning, enabling deeper spiritual insight. As a destination, it signifies the ultimate realization of fana, where individual identity dissolves into oneness with divine reality. The person who never posts is unlikely to experience this ultimate mystical union, but they taste something of it whenever they are fully present in their lives without the mediating layer of self-documentation. These moments of undivided attention are becoming increasingly rare in our hyper-connected culture, which is why the psychology of the non-poster is so fascinating. They have preserved something that most of us have lost, often without realizing what we've sacrificed. The research on lurking behavior reveals that these individuals often possess a more nuanced understanding of online social dynamics than active posters. They see how the psychological loop of comparison, desire, and dissatisfaction operates because they observe it from outside rather than being caught within it. They notice how people curate their lives to present an idealized version of themselves, how every post is strategic, even when it pretends to be spontaneous, how the currency of social media is not actually connection, but attention. This perception can lead to cynicism, a dismissive attitude towards social media and those who use it actively. But it can also lead to compassion, to a recognition that everyone is struggling in their own way with the impossible demands of digital self-presentation, that the person posting constant vacation photos may be just as lonely and uncertain as the lurker who scrolls through them in silence. Ibn Arabi's concept of the observer and the observed as ultimately unified offers a way to hold this paradox. When we judge others for their social media behavior, we are really judging an aspect of ourselves, a possibility we either embrace or reject. The lurker who looks down on active posters is creating a false distinction, establishing themselves as somehow superior or more authentic, when in reality both positions are responses to the same existential challenge: how to maintain authentic selfhood in an environment designed to commodify and fragment identity. Ibn Arabi taught that such dualistic thinking nullifies unity, preventing us from perceiving the underlying reality that encompasses both silence and speech, both withdrawal and engagement. The path to wisdom requires moving beyond these false dichotomies into a more integrated understanding that can hold contradiction without needing to resolve it. This integrated understanding recognizes that the psychology of people who never post is not monolithic. There are as many reasons for silence as there are silent people. Some are introverted by temperament, finding social interaction exhausting, whether digital or physical. Some are protecting their privacy in an age of surveillance capitalism where personal data is harvested and sold without meaningful consent. Some are avoiding the anxiety and social comparison that social media inevitably triggers, having learned through painful experience that these platforms do not enhance their well-being. Some are making a deliberate philosophical choice to resist the culture of performative identity and constant self-promotion, and some are simply disengaged, scrolling through feeds out of habit or boredom without any deep motivation to add their voice to the chorus. Ibn Arabi would remind us that all of these motivations exist within the larger context of the soul's journey toward truth. Every person is seeking the real being, whether they conceptualize it in religious terms or not, whether they are conscious of their seeking or not. The person who posts constantly is seeking validation and connection, trying to prove their existence by leaving digital traces that others will acknowledge. The person who never posts is seeking something different, perhaps authenticity, perhaps peace, perhaps simply the freedom to exist without constant self-justification. Neither path is inherently superior, though each has its hazards and opportunities. What matters is whether the path is walked consciously, with awareness of its costs and benefits, or unconsciously, as a default response to psychological pressures we don't fully understand. The spiritual dimension of silence that Ibn Arabi explored offers profound insights into the psychology of the non-poster. He taught that silence is not merely the absence of sound, but a profound state of being, a gateway to heightened consciousness. This understanding contradicts our culture's assumption that silence is empty, that only speech and action have value, that visibility equals existence. The mystic knows that the deepest truths cannot be spoken, that certain experiences lose their essence when translated into language, that the most sacred aspects of life are precisely those that cannot be posted, hashtagged, or liked. The person who doesn't post has intuited this truth, sensing that something is lost in the translation from lived experience to digital content, even if they can't articulate exactly what that something is. What is lost is immediacy, the unmediated encounter with reality that occurs when consciousness meets the world directly, without the interference of self-consciousness or the need to narrate experience. Ibn Arabi taught that the rational path needs to be complemented by mystical intuition, by the unveiling that allows for imaginal vision. The heart, in his philosophy, is the organ of perception that can grasp truths beyond the reach of reason. Social media engages the rational, calculating mind almost exclusively. We strategize about what to post, analyze the responses we receive, compare our metrics to others, plan our content calendar. This constant engagement of the rational mind crowds out the spaciousness required for mystical intuition, for the kind of knowing that comes through silence and receptivity rather than through analysis and performance. The non-poster preserves this spaciousness, maintaining an inner quiet that allows for deeper forms of perception and understanding. Contemporary psychology confirms that this inner quiet has measurable benefits for mental health and emotional well-being. People who are less dependent on external validation tend to have more stable self-esteem, better emotional regulation, and greater resilience in the face of adversity. They are not riding the emotional roller coaster that social media engagement creates, where a post that gets lots of likes produces a dopamine hit, while one that gets ignored triggers feelings of rejection and inadequacy. Their mood is less dependent on factors outside their control, which gives them a kind of psychological freedom that active posters often lack. This freedom comes at a cost. They may miss out on certain forms of connection and community that social media can facilitate, but for many non-posters, the trade-off is worth it. Ibn Arabi's teaching about the necessity of renouncing the self to perceive truth provides a mystical perspective on this psychological freedom. He said that to become truth, one must dissolve oneself, expire in truth, see truth through the eye of truth itself. The ego is the primary barrier to this perception, and social media is fundamentally a technology that strengthens rather than dissolves the ego. Every post is a declaration of self. I exist, I matter, I have something worth saying. And every like or comment reinforces that declaration. The person who refuses to post is not necessarily engaged in ego death in the mystical sense, but they are at least not actively feeding the ego through constant digital self-assertion. This creates space for other modes of being, other ways of relating to self and world, that don't center the ego so completely. The transformation that occurs through sustained silence is subtle but profound. Ibn Arabi taught that certain truths about existence transcend the limits of language and the constructs of self, and that by entering the realm of silence, individuals access a deeper understanding of reality that words cannot convey. The person who doesn't post begins to experience life differently. Not better or worse necessarily, but different. Their experiences don't need to be validated by others to feel real, because they are learning to validate their own experience internally. They develop trust in their own perceptions, rather than constantly checking whether others share their interpretation of events. This internal validation is psychologically liberating because it breaks the cycle of dependence on external approval that social media creates and reinforces. But this liberation also brings responsibility. Ibn Arabi emphasized that spiritual development is not about withdrawal from the world, but about engaging with it more fully, more consciously, from a place of greater awareness. The person who never posts must ask themselves whether their silence serves their growth or simply allows them to avoid the discomfort of genuine connection. Are they observing the world with compassionate presence, or are they using observation as a shield against vulnerability? Are they comfortable with their own company, or are they hiding from the challenge of showing up authentically in spaces where they might be judged or rejected? These questions don't have easy answers, and the honest answer may change depending on the day and the context. The research on lurking behavior suggests that motivations are complex and often contradictory. A person might lurk because they value privacy and also because they fear judgment, because they find social media exhausting, and also because they feel left out of conversations they wish they could join. The human psyche is not neat or consistent, and our relationship with technology reflects all of our inner contradictions and conflicts. Ibn Arabi would say that this complexity itself is a manifestation of the divine, that the real being expresses itself through infinite variations and contradictions, and that trying to reduce human behavior to simple explanations misses the richness of what it means to be alive. The psychological profile of the non-poster often includes higher levels of self-reflection and critical thinking. They question assumptions that others take for granted, like the assumption that having a large social media following is desirable, or that documenting experiences makes them more meaningful, or that connection requires constant communication. This questioning can lead to a more examined life, one that is lived according to consciously chosen values rather than unconsciously absorbed social norms. But it can also lead to a kind of paralysis, where the person becomes so critical of social media and its effects that they withdraw from all digital social interaction, cutting themselves off from communities and conversations that might genuinely enrich their lives. Ibn Arabi's philosophy of balance offers guidance here. He taught that both transcendence and immanence are necessary, that the divine is both hidden and manifest, both beyond comprehension and intimately present in every moment. Applied to the question of social media engagement, this suggests that neither constant posting nor complete withdrawal is ideal. Rather, a middle path that honors both the need for connection and the need for privacy, both the value of sharing and the value of silence, both the manifest and the hidden dimensions of self. This middle path will look different for each person, depending on their temperament, circumstances, and stage of life. What matters is that the choice is made consciously, with awareness of what is gained and what is lost in either direction. The person who never posts is making a choice, whether they recognize it as such or not. They are choosing silence over speech, observation over performance, privacy over exposure. This choice carries implications for how they experience themselves and how they relate to others. It affects their sense of connection to the broader culture, their visibility in professional and social networks, their ability to influence or be influenced by the currents of public conversation. These effects are neither entirely positive nor entirely negative, but they are real and deserve to be acknowledged. The non-poster who pretends their choice has no consequences is deceiving themselves just as much as the active poster, who pretends that digital connection is equivalent to genuine intimacy. Ibn Arabi's mystical psychology offers a framework for understanding these consequences in spiritual terms. He taught that every soul is on a journey toward the real, and that this journey involves both outward manifestation and inward concealment. The person who posts constantly risks losing themselves in manifestation, becoming so identified with their public persona that they forget the hidden depths of their being. The person who never posts risks the opposite error, becoming so hidden that they fail to manifest their gifts and contributions in the world, hoarding their light instead of letting it shine. The ideal, according to Ibn Arabi, is to maintain awareness of both dimensions simultaneously, to know oneself as both hidden essence and manifest form, to move fluidly between silence and speech according to the needs of the moment rather than according to fixed patterns of behavior. This fluid movement requires a high degree of self-awareness and emotional maturity. It means being able to tolerate the discomfort of visibility when speaking is called for, and being able to tolerate the discomfort of invisibility when silence is more appropriate. Most people, whether they post constantly or never post at all, have developed fixed patterns as a way of managing anxiety, predictable behaviors that feel safe because they're familiar. Breaking these patterns requires courage and consciousness, a willingness to experiment with different ways of being and to learn from the results. For the person who has never posted, this might mean taking the risk of sharing something authentic, seeing what happens and discovering that the feared consequences don't materialize or are less terrible than imagined. For the person who posts constantly, it might mean taking a break from social media and discovering that their sense of self doesn't dissolve without the constant reinforcement of external validation. The psychology of the non-poster reveals something essential about human nature that our current cultural moment tends to obscure. We are not fundamentally performers seeking an audience. We are beings seeking truth, meaning, and authentic connection. The technologies we've created, social media platforms designed to maximize engagement and monetize attention, do not necessarily serve these deeper needs. In fact, they often work against them, creating an environment where performance is rewarded and authenticity is punished, where the appearance of connection substitutes for genuine relationship, where the quest for meaning is reduced to the accumulation of likes and followers. The person who never posts has sensed this misalignment, whether consciously or unconsciously, and has opted out of a system that doesn't serve their well-being. Ibn Arabi would call this opting out a form of spiritual intelligence, a recognition that certain environments are toxic to the soul and must be avoided or engaged with extreme caution. He taught that silence, solitude, hunger, and wakefulness are the four cornerstones of the spiritual way. The person who never posts has embraced at least two of these cornerstones, silence and solitude, in the digital realm, recognizing that constant communication and connection can prevent the deeper work of self-understanding and transformation. This doesn't mean they are necessarily more spiritually advanced than active social media users, but it does suggest that they have preserved certain capacities that are endangered by the dominant technological culture. The capacity for sustained attention is perhaps the most important of these endangered capacities. Research consistently shows that social media use fragments attention, training the brain to expect constant novelty and stimulation, making it increasingly difficult to focus on complex tasks or engage in deep thinking. The person who spends less time on social media, whether as an active poster or a lurker, preserves their capacity for sustained focus, for the kind of absorption in a task or experience that psychologists call flow. This capacity is essential not only for productivity and creativity, but for the quality of subjective experience itself, for the ability to lose oneself in an activity and experience the timelessness that comes with complete engagement. Ibn Arabi's concept of mystical observation, where the observer and observed become one, describes this state of complete engagement. When we are fully absorbed in an activity, the self-consciousness that normally separates us from our experience falls away, and there is only the activity itself happening. The person who is constantly thinking about how to document their experience for social media cannot achieve this state because they remain split, divided between experiencing and observing the experience from the outside. The non-poster has a better chance of achieving this unity, though simply not posting doesn't guarantee it. What matters is the quality of attention they bring to their lives, not just the absence of documentation. This quality of attention is cultivated through practice, through the repeated choice to be fully present rather than divided. Ibn Arabi taught that spiritual development is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing process of refinement and deepening. The person who never posts may find that their initial choice to remain silent evolves over time as they become more conscious of their motivations and more skilled at navigating the digital landscape. They may discover that selective posting, sharing occasionally and intentionally, rather than constantly and compulsively, allows them to maintain both connection and privacy, both visibility and depth. Or they may discover that complete abstinence from posting serves them best, that any engagement with performative self-presentation pulls them away from the authenticity they value. There is no universal prescription here, no single right answer that applies to everyone. The diversity of human temperament and circumstance means that what serves one person's well-being may harm another's. The introverted person who finds all social interaction draining will have different needs than the extroverted person who is energized by connection. The person with a history of trauma around visibility and judgment will have different challenges than someone who has always felt comfortable in the spotlight. Ibn Arabi's philosophy honors this diversity, recognizing that the real manifests through infinite variations and that each soul has its own unique path toward truth. What unites all non-posters, despite their varied motivations and circumstances, is the choice to privilege private experience over public performance. This choice has become increasingly countercultural in an age where visibility is equated with existence, where the unposted life is somehow less real than the documented one. The non-poster resist this equation, insisting on the value of experiences that exist only in memory, of thoughts that never become tweets, of moments that are lived fully but never shared. This resistance is quietly radical, a form of cultural rebellion that doesn't announce itself but simply persists in being different. Ibn Arabi would recognize this quiet radicalism as aligned with the mystic's path. The mystic doesn't seek to reform society or change others, but simply to align their own being with truth as they perceive it. By refusing to participate in the dominant culture's obsession with self-promotion and constant sharing, the non-poster demonstrates that other ways of being are possible. They show through their example that you can exist without constantly proving your existence, that your life can have meaning and value even if no one outside your immediate circle knows about it, that silence can be full rather than empty. This demonstration matters more than it might seem. In a culture where most people feel trapped by the expectations of social media, knowing it harms their well-being, but feeling unable to step away because everyone else is there, the example of those who have opted out provides hope and permission. It suggests that the trap is not as inescapable as it appears, that liberation is possible, that there are viable alternatives to the exhausting performance of digital identity. The non-poster may not see themselves as offering this example, may not realize that their choice to remain silent speaks volumes to others who are questioning their own relationship with social media. But the influence of their choice ripples outward nonetheless, creating possibilities for others who have not yet found the courage to trust their own doubts about the value of constant connectivity. The psychology of people who never post reveals the human capacity for discernment, for choosing what serves well-being even when that choice goes against cultural norms. It shows that we are not helplessly determined by technology, not mere puppets of the algorithm, but beings capable of stepping back and evaluating whether particular tools and practices enhance or diminish our lives. This capacity for discernment is precious and needs to be protected against the forces, commercial, social, psychological, that would erode it. The non-poster exercises this discernment, whether consciously or unconsciously, and in doing so, maintains something essential about what it means to be human. Ibn Arabi taught that the highest form of knowledge is direct experiential knowledge of the divine, which transcends the limits of reason and language. This knowledge cannot be posted, cannot be shared through social media, cannot be reduced to content. It can only be lived, experienced directly in the silence of the heart, when all the noise, external and internal, falls away. The person who never posts may not achieve this mystical knowledge, but they have at least created the conditions under which it becomes possible. They have protected the silence, preserved the spaciousness, maintained the boundaries that prevent their inner life from being colonized by the constant demands of digital performance. In the end, the question is not whether posting or not posting is better, but what kind of life each of us wants to live and what practices support that vision. For some, social media enhances their sense of connection and community, allows them to share their gifts with the world, creates opportunities that would not exist otherwise. For others, it diminishes their well-being, fragments their attention, pulls them away from what matters most. The non-poster has made their choice consciously or unconsciously, and that choice reflects something true about who they are and what they value. The invitation for all of us is to become more conscious of our own choices, more aware of how we use technology and how technology uses us, more intentional about what we share and what we keep private. Ibn Arabi's mystical vision offers a final insight into the psychology of the non-poster, that silence is not the opposite of speech, but its complement, that both are needed for wholeness, that the wisest path moves between them according to what each moment requires. The person who has never posted may eventually discover that there are times when speaking is necessary, when sharing serves not ego but truth, when visibility is called for despite its risks, and the person who posts constantly may eventually discover that there are depths of experience that cannot be captured in content, aspects of self that wither when exposed to public view, truths that can only be known in silence. Both discoveries lead toward the same destination, a more conscious, more integrated way of being that honors all dimensions of human experience without privileging any single aspect. The psychology of people who never post is ultimately about the human search for authenticity in an age of performance, for depth in an era of surfaces, for silence in a world of constant noise. It's about the courage to trust one's own experience, even when it contradicts cultural messages about what makes a life valuable or meaningful. It's about the wisdom of knowing what to reveal and what to conceal, when to speak and when to remain silent, how to exist in digital spaces without losing touch with the analog realities that ground and sustain us. And perhaps most importantly, it's about the recognition that we are more than what we post, that our true identity exists not in the curated images and carefully crafted captions, but in the silent depths where no algorithm can reach. Ibn Arabi knew 8 centuries ago what the non-poster knows today, that the most profound truths cannot be spoken, that the deepest wisdom lives in silence, that the real self is hidden not because it's shameful, but because it's sacred. In choosing silence, the non-poster honors this sacredness, protecting the inner sanctuary from invasion by forces that would turn it into content, that would monetize and measure and render mundane what should remain mysterious. This choice may be countercultural, may even be lonely at times, but it is also deeply sane, a form of resistance against the technological colonization of consciousness that threatens to leave no aspect of human experience uncommercial, unpublicized, unshared. In their silence, the non-posters remind us that another way is possible, that we do not have to surrender every moment to the feed, that some things are worth keeping for ourselves alone.